Level 1. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, 2014. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 was a scheduled international flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. On March 8, 2014, the Boeing 777 took off shortly after midnight with 239 people on board. Everything looked routine at first. The aircraft climbed smoothly, the weather was clear, and radio contact was normal. But less than an hour into the flight, MH370 disappeared from radar screens without a distress call. What followed was one of the most extensive and expensive search operations in aviation history. Military radar later showed the aircraft had deviated dramatically from its planned route, turning west across the Malay Peninsula, then south into the Indian Ocean. After that, no further contact was made. For years, search teams combed thousands of square kilometers of ocean. Some debris from the plane eventually washed ashore on islands in the western Indian Ocean, confirming the aircraft had crashed. But the main wreckage, including the black boxes, has never been found. Theories range from mechanical failure to hijacking to deliberate action by someone in the cockpit, but without the flight recorders, nothing can be proven. The official investigation concluded the flight ended in the southern Indian Ocean, but how and why it got there remains one of aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries. Tenerife Airport Disaster, 1977. The Tenerife Airport disaster remains the deadliest aviation accident in history involving two aircraft. It happened on March 27, 1977, at Los Rodeos Airport on the Spanish Canary Island of Tenerife. Two Boeing 747 jumbo jets, one operated by KLM, the other by Pan Am, collided on the runway in thick fog, killing 583 people. The disaster wasn't caused by a single failure, but by a combination of miscommunication, poor visibility, and unfortunate timing. That day, the nearby Gran Canaria airport had received a terrorist bomb threat. As a result, many inbound flights were diverted to the smaller Los Rodeos airport, which quickly became overcrowded. The Pan Am 747 had landed and was taxiing slowly down the single runway, trying to find its exit in the fog. At the same time, the KLM 747 was at the start of the runway, fully fueled and preparing for takeoff. Visibility was extremely limited. Controllers and pilots couldn't see each other. Radio instructions were also overlapping and unclear. Believing he had clearance to take off, the KLM captain applied full throttle and began rolling down the foggy runway. But the Pan Am jet was still taxiing ahead, unseen. By the time the Pan Am crew spotted landing lights rushing toward them, it was too late. The KLM aircraft tried to lift off early, scraping its belly on the runway and striking the top of the Pan Am 747. Both aircraft exploded in flames. Remarkably, 61 people survived, mostly on the Pan Am flight. Everyone on board the KLM aircraft died instantly. The investigation revealed critical communication failures between the KLM crew and air traffic control, as well as ambiguous phraseology like, "We are at takeoff," being misinterpreted as "cleared for takeoff." This tragedy led to major reforms in cockpit communication, including standardized phraseology like "ready for departure," and the widespread use of crew resource management training. Japan Airlines Flight 123, 1985. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is the deadliest single-aircraft accident in aviation history. It happened on August 12, 1985, on a routine domestic flight from Tokyo to Osaka. On board was a Boeing 747 SR, specially designed for short, high-density routes in Japan. That evening, it carried 524 people, most of them returning home after the Aben holiday. The flight departed from Haneda Airport at 6:12 p.m. Just 12 minutes later, something went catastrophically wrong. A loud noise shook the aircraft, followed by rapid decompression. Unknown to the passengers, the rear pressure bulkhead, a key structural component, had failed. The vertical stabilizer ripped off, and all 4 hydraulic systems were lost. The crew no longer had control of the aircraft. From that point on, Flight 123 flew on for nearly 30 minutes, completely crippled. The pilots struggled to keep the plane stable using only engine thrust, a near-impossible task. The aircraft began a series of erratic climbs and descents as it drifted northwest, far off course. At 6:56 p.m., the Boeing slammed into a mountain ridge in a remote area of Gunma Prefecture. The impact and post-crash fire killed 520 people. Only 4 survived, all seated near the rear of the cabin. The cause of the accident was traced back to a repair made 7 years earlier, in 1978. After a tailstrike incident, Boeing technicians had incorrectly repaired the pressure bulkhead, using a doubler plate that didn't meet specifications. Over time, metal fatigue built up at the joint until the structure failed. The tragedy led to widespread changes in aircraft maintenance oversight. It also exposed gaps in Japan's emergency response system. Rescue teams took hours to reach the crash site, and some survivors may have died waiting. Air France Flight 447, 1 June 2009. Air France Flight 447 was a scheduled overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. On June 1, 2009, the Airbus A330 took off from Brazil with 228 people on board, 216 passengers, and 12 crew. The flight was expected to take around 10.5 hours. Instead, just hours after departure, the aircraft vanished over the Atlantic. For several hours, no one knew anything was wrong. The last radio contact was routine. But when the plane failed to check in with air traffic control in Senegal, alarm bells started ringing. A search and rescue operation began, but for days, only small pieces of floating debris were found. The full wreckage wouldn't be located until nearly 2 years later, deep under the ocean, at a depth of almost 4,000 meters. What had happened? About 3.5 hours into the flight, the plane encountered a region of intense thunderstorms, a common feature over the equatorial Atlantic. In that area, the plane's pitot tubes, the sensors that measure airspeed, iced over. This caused inconsistent airspeed readings. As a result, the autopilot disconnected automatically, handing manual control back to the pilots. But instead of leveling the plane or slightly lowering the nose, the standard response in such conditions, the co-pilot pulled back on the controls, causing the aircraft to climb and lose speed. Unaware of what was happening, the crew kept the nose up, even as stall warnings sounded repeatedly. For more than 3 minutes, the plane was in a full aerodynamic stall, falling through the sky while tilted nose up. The pilots never realized the aircraft was stalled. They never regained control. At 2:14 a.m. UTC, the Airbus crashed into the Atlantic at high speed. All 228 people on board were killed instantly. The investigation by France's BEA revealed a mix of sensor failure and human error. the pilots were not adequately trained for manual flying at high altitude or for recognizing stall conditions. After the crash, pilot training programs around the world were revised to include more manual flying time and stall recovery procedures. Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 was a transatlantic flight from London to New York, scheduled on December 21, 1988. It was just 3 days before Christmas. On board, 243 passengers and 16 crew members. Many were students heading home for the holidays. Others were business travelers, families, newlyweds. The aircraft, a Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas, departed Heathrow Airport in the evening and climbed to cruising altitude. But just 38 minutes into the flight, while flying over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, something catastrophic happened. At 31,000 feet, a bomb hidden in the forward cargo hold exploded. The blast tore a hole in the fuselage. In seconds, the nose section broke off, the cabin depressurized, and the rest of the plane disintegrated midair. Wreckage fell across a vast area, some pieces landing in open fields, others crashing directly into homes in Lockerbie. All 259 people on board were killed. On the ground, 11 residents lost their lives as flaming debris destroyed houses. The impact left a deep crater, and the devastation spread across several streets. It wasn't just an aviation disaster, it was a bombing in the middle of a quiet town. The investigation quickly pointed to a suitcase loaded with explosives, checked in at Malta, transferred through Frankfurt, and loaded onto Flight 103 in London. The bomb was cleverly hidden inside a Toshiba radio cassette player. Years of forensic work and international cooperation followed. In 2001, a Libyan intelligence officer, Abdel Basset al-Megrahi, was convicted for the bombing. Libya later accepted responsibility and paid compensation to victims' families, though debates about the full truth continue to this day. Pan Am 103 changed aviation security forever. The attack exposed vulnerabilities in baggage screening and international transfer protocols. It led to stricter luggage checks, more intelligence sharing, and reinforced rules for unaccompanied bags. Level 2, TWA 800 1996. TWA Flight 800 was a scheduled international flight from New York to Paris. On July 17, 1996, the Boeing 747 lifted off from JFK Airport at 8:19 p.m. On board were 230 people, 212 passengers, and 18 crew. Most were American. Many were students, tourists, and families heading to Europe for the summer. 12 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through 13,000 feet off the coast of Long Island, it exploded. Air traffic control lost contact instantly. Fishermen, boaters, and residents on shore reported seeing a fireball in the sky. The aircraft had broken apart midair. Wreckage rained down into the Atlantic Ocean, scattering debris over a wide area. There were no survivors. Recovery began quickly. Ships, divers, and helicopters combed the sea for bodies and parts of the plane. Over time, investigators managed to recover about 95% of the aircraft by weight. In a hangar, the NTSB reconstructed the center section of the fuselage to understand what happened. The investigation lasted 4 years. Early on, there was public speculation about a missile strike or terrorist bomb. Over 700 eyewitnesses had seen something streaking upward in the sky, but the FBI found no trace of explosives or shrapnel. The NTSB ruled out any external attack. The final report, pointed to the center wing fuel tank as the origin of the explosion. That tank was nearly empty and had been heated by air conditioning units located directly beneath it. Inside, a flammable fuel-air mixture had formed. The most likely ignition source was a short circuit, possibly from aging or damaged wiring, that caused a spark inside the tank. Once ignited, the fuel vapors exploded, tearing the aircraft apart. Following the crash, aviation authorities introduced new regulations to reduce the risk of fuel tank explosions. These included rewiring older aircraft, changing how air conditioning systems vent heat, and later installing nitrogen-inerting systems to displace oxygen inside empty fuel tanks. Swissair 111, 1998. Swissair Flight 111 was a transatlantic flight from New York's JFK Airport to Geneva, Switzerland. On September 2, 1998, the aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, took off in the evening with 229 people on board, 215 passengers and 14 crew. The flight was routine for the first hour. But at around 10:10 p.m., while cruising at 33,000 feet off the coast of Nova Scotia, the pilots noticed a strange smell in the cockpit, a light smoke, initially thought to come from the air conditioning. They radioed air traffic control with a pan-pan call, indicating an urgent but not critical issue. They requested a diversion to the nearest major airport, Halifax, Nova Scotia. As the aircraft began descending and preparing for approach, the situation worsened rapidly. The smoke intensified. Fire had started above and behind the cockpit ceiling panels, hidden from view. As it spread, it began disabling critical systems, flight displays, radios, lighting. The pilots tried to shut off non-essential power, but it was too late. Electrical systems began failing one by one. The cockpit grew dark and filled with smoke. Instruments became unreadable. Despite their efforts, the crew lost control. At 10:31 p.m., just 20 minutes after the first sign of trouble, Swissair 111 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean near Peggy's Cove. The impact was devastating. All 229 people on board died instantly. The investigation, led by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, lasted over 4 years. The cause was traced to faulty wiring associated with the aircraft's in-flight entertainment system. A short circuit likely ignited flammable insulation materials above the cockpit. The materials used, including metallized PET insulation blankets, were later found to be highly combustible, allowing the fire to spread unchecked. The crew had no access to that part of the plane, and no onboard fire suppression system could reach it. In the aftermath, regulators implemented stricter rules on fire-resistant materials, wiring protection, and smoke detection systems in hidden areas of the aircraft. American Airlines 191, 1979. American Airlines Flight 191 was a routine flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. On May 25, 1979, the aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, was cleared for takeoff from runway 32R at O'Hare International Airport. On board were 271 people, 258 passengers, and 13 crew. At 3:02 p.m. local time, the plane began its takeoff roll. Just moments after liftoff, something went catastrophically wrong. The number 1 engine, mounted on the left wing, suddenly tore away from the aircraft. But it wasn't just the engine. The entire pylon structure that held it in place had broken off, damaging part of the wing and severing hydraulic lines and electrical connections. That damage caused the leading-edge slats on the left wing to retract, while the right wing's slats remained extended. The result? A severe lift imbalance. The left wing began to stall while the right wing kept flying. Within seconds, the aircraft rolled sharply to the left. The cockpit instruments tied to that wing, including the slat position indicators and warnings, had lost power when the engine detached, so the crew didn't know the slats had retracted. They followed standard engine-out procedures, reducing climb speed to V2, but that speed was no longer enough to keep the aircraft airborne with the loss of lift. 31 seconds after takeoff, Flight 191 rolled past 90 degrees and crashed into a nearby field just beyond the airport perimeter. The explosion was massive. All 271 people on board were killed, along with 2 people on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident to occur on U.S. soil. The investigation revealed that the engine separation was caused by faulty maintenance procedures. American Airlines had used a forklift method to remove and reinstall the engine and pylon as a single unit, a shortcut not recommended by the manufacturer. This process overstressed a mounting bracket, creating a crack that grew over time until it failed. In response, the FAA issued immediate directives to change how DC-10 engines were handled during maintenance. Airlines were also required to inspect all engine mounts for similar stress fractures. Korean Airlines 7, 1983. Korean Airlines Flight 7 was a regularly scheduled passenger flight from New York City to Seoul via Anchorage, Alaska. On September 1, 1983, the Boeing 747-230B, tail number HL7442, was carrying 269 people, 246 passengers, and 23 crew. Shortly after departing Anchorage, the flight was supposed to follow a planned route, J501, over the North Pacific toward Alaska, then across Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula to reach Seoul. But it drifted off course for reasons that remain disputed. At some point in this deviation, the aircraft entered Soviet airspace near Sakhalin Island. Soviet air defense forces tracked the aircraft and, believing it to be an unidentified intruder or even a spy plane, scrambled interceptor jets. And Su-15 interceptor launched 2 air-to-air missiles. The first missile exploded behind the fuselage, the second struck the left wing area. The blasts damaged the flight control systems, including hydraulic systems. The airplane began climbing unexpectedly, oscillating, then descending. After missile impact, the crew reported rapid decompression, attempted to descend, tried to maintain control manually, but once key systems were disabled, control was lost. The aircraft crashed into the Sea of Japan near Monron Island, west of Sakhalin. All 269 aboard died. In investigations, it was found that the aircraft's navigation error likely came from using the autopilot in heading mode instead of proper INS guidance, or from failing to switch in time, which allowed drift off route. Also, communication and detection systems did not alert the crew or air traffic controllers fast enough of the deviation. Level 3. Charkhi Dadri Midair Collision, 1996. On November 12, 1996, 2 large aircraft collided in midair near the town of Charkhi Dadri, India. A total of 349 people died. There were no survivors. The first aircraft was Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763, a Boeing 747 that had just taken off from Delhi, heading to Dhahran with 312 people on board. The second was Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, an Ilyushin Il-76 cargo and passenger jet approaching Delhi from Shymkent, Kazakhstan, with 37 people aboard. At the time, Delhi airspace was busy and relied heavily on voice communication between pilots and air traffic controllers. Radar coverage was limited, and altitude information was not always visible to controllers in real time. Saudi 763 was cleared to climb to 14,000 feet. Kazakh 1907 was descending and had been instructed to maintain 15,000 feet until further clearance, but something went wrong. The Kazakh aircraft began descending below its assigned altitude. The air traffic controller repeatedly warned the crew that another aircraft was at 14,000 feet ahead, but the Kazakh crew either didn't understand or failed to respond properly. English language communication was a major issue. The Kazakh crew relied on a radio operator to interpret instructions, and cockpit coordination was poor. At 6:40 p.m. local time, the two aircraft collided. The left wing of the Kazakh Il-76 sliced through the tail and wing of the Saudi 747. Both aircraft broke apart in the air and crashed separately into fields near rural villages. The wreckage was spread over a wide area. Local villagers were the first to reach the crash sites. There were no survivors from either plane. The investigation concluded that the primary cause was the Kazakh crew's failure to maintain their assigned altitude. Contributing factors included poor English proficiency, over-reliance on a radio interpreter, lack of a modern radar system at Delhi, and the absence of collision avoidance systems on both aircraft. After the crash, India made onboard traffic collision avoidance systems, TCAS, mandatory for all commercial aircraft operating in its airspace, one of the first countries to do so. Air India Flight 182, June 23, 1985. Air India Flight 182 was a scheduled international flight from Toronto to Delhi with planned stops in Montreal and London. On June 23, 1985, the Boeing 747 named Emperor Kanishka was flying over the Atlantic Ocean, south of Ireland, when it broke apart midair. All 329 people on board were killed. The aircraft had departed Montreal and was cruising at 31,000 feet. At 7:14 a.m. Irish time, radio contact was lost. Minutes later, radar images showed the plane suddenly disappear from screens. Debris was later found floating in the ocean about 190 kilometers southwest of the Irish coast. The cause was a bomb placed in a suitcase in the forward cargo hold. It detonated while the aircraft was at cruising altitude, destroying the forward section of the fuselage. The plane disintegrated in midair and crashed into the sea in multiple large pieces. Only 132 bodies were recovered. The rest were lost at sea. Recovery operations took months and involved sonar, underwater robotics, and deep-sea divers. Both the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were located and recovered from the ocean floor. The bombing was carried out by Sikh extremists operating in Canada. The attack was coordinated to coincide with another bomb that exploded at Narita Airport in Tokyo on the same day, killing 2 baggage handlers. That device had also been intended for an Air India flight. Investigations revealed that the suitcase bomb had been checked in at Vancouver under a false name and was transferred to Flight 182 in Toronto without the passenger ever boarding. The Canadian government later admitted major intelligence and security failures. Wiretap information and warnings had not been acted upon. Multiple suspects were identified, but only one person, Inderjit Singh Rayat, was convicted for constructing the bomb. Air India Flight 182 remains the deadliest aviation disaster involving a Canadian aircraft and the worst act of aviation terrorism before 9/11. Iran Air Flight 655, July 3, 1988. Iran Air Flight 655 was a scheduled passenger flight from Tehran to Dubai, with a stopover in Bandar Abbas. On July 3, 1988, the aircraft was shot down by a missile fired from a U.S. Navy warship over the Strait of Hormuz. All 290 people on board were killed. The aircraft was an Airbus A300, operated by Iran Air. That morning, it took off from Bandar Abbas with 274 passengers and 16 crew. It was a short international flight across the Persian Gulf, following a standard commercial air corridor known as Amber 59. At the same time, the USS Vincennes, a U.S. Navy-guided missile cruiser, was operating in the Gulf, engaged in a tense naval encounter with Iranian gunboats. The region was on high alert due to ongoing tensions during the Iran-Iraq War. As Flight 655 climbed through 13,500 feet, heading toward its cruising altitude, the crew of the Vincennes identified the radar return as an Iranian military F-14 Tomcat. Despite the aircraft broadcasting a civilian transponder signal and flying on a known commercial route, the warship's Combat Information Center believed it posed a threat. Radio warnings were sent on both civilian and military frequencies. It remains unclear whether these messages reached the Iranian pilots, who were in normal contact with Iranian air traffic control and unaware of any danger. At 10:24 a.m., the USS Vincennes launched 2 surface-to-air missiles. Both struck the aircraft. The plane broke up in midair and fell into the Gulf in multiple sections. No one survived. The victims included 254 Iranians, along with citizens of the UAE, India, Pakistan, Yugoslavia, and Italy. Among the dead were 66 children. The United States initially defended the shootdown as an act of self-defense. Later investigations confirmed that the plane had been misidentified. The U.S. government expressed regret and eventually paid compensation to the victims' families, but no official apology was issued. Iran Air Flight 655 remains the deadliest airliner shootdown by a military force. EgyptAir Flight 990, October 31, 1999. EgyptAir Flight 990 was a scheduled international flight from Los Angeles to Cairo, with a planned stopover at New York's JFK Airport. On October 31, 1999, the Boeing 767-300ER took off from New York shortly after 1:20 a.m. Eastern Time. On board were 217 people, 203 passengers, and 14 crew members. About 33 minutes after takeoff, while cruising at 33,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, the aircraft suddenly began to descend rapidly. Within moments, it entered a steep dive. The plane broke apart on impact with the ocean's surface, about 100 kilometers south of Nantucket Island. There were no survivors. The flight had 2 alternating flight crews, as is standard on long-haul routes. At the time of the incident, the captain had left the cockpit, and the relief first officer, Gamil Al-Batoudi, was at the controls. According to flight recorder data, the autopilot was disconnected manually. Throttle levers were pulled to idle. The aircraft began to descend. The cockpit voice recorder captured repeated phrases in Arabic, followed by the captain re-entering the cockpit and asking, "What's happening?" As the aircraft continued to dive, moments later, there was partial recovery. The captain appears to have pulled back on the controls, briefly arresting the dive. But soon after, the aircraft entered a second, even steeper dive. Structural stress caused it to break apart midair before hitting the ocean. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash was caused by deliberate control inputs made by the relief first officer, for reasons unknown. The Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority disagreed, citing the possibility of a mechanical failure, but no evidence was found to support that. Wreckage was recovered from the seafloor at a depth of nearly 80 meters. Both flight recorders were found and analyzed. No technical fault could explain the control inputs or flight profile. The case remains controversial due to disagreement between American and Egyptian investigators, but the flight data clearly showed that the descent was manually commanded. Saudia Flight 163, August 19, 1980. Saudia Flight 163 was a scheduled flight from Karachi to Jeddah with a stopover in Riyadh. On August 19, 1980, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar took off from Riyadh with 301 people on board, 287 passengers and 14 crew members. Less than an hour later, everyone on board was dead. The aircraft had just departed from Riyadh Airport at 9:08 p.m. local time. About 7 minutes into the flight, the crew received a smoke warning from the aft cargo compartment. The flight engineer confirmed the presence of smoke in the cabin. The captain decided to return to the airport immediately. During the descent and approach back to Riyadh, the situation worsened. Smoke began to spread through the cabin. The crew declared an emergency and performed a successful landing at 9:36 p.m. But what followed was a complete breakdown in evacuation and response. After touchdown, the aircraft rolled to the end of the runway, exited onto a taxiway, and came to a full stop at 9:39 p.m. Despite visible smoke and growing fire inside the aircraft, the engines were not shut down for another 3 minutes. That delay prevented ground crews from approaching and blocked cabin crew from opening the doors. By the time fire crews accessed the cabin, it was too late. All 301 occupants died on board. Most died from smoke inhalation. There was no fire damage to the forward fuselage, and investigators found passengers seated upright, still strapped in their seats. No evacuation was attempted. The fire's origin was traced to the rear cargo hold, but the exact cause was never confirmed. Possible explanations included a flammable gas stove or electrical failure. The aircraft's plug-type exit doors required significant force to open against internal pressure, which further delayed rescue efforts. Saudia Flight 163 remains one of the deadliest incidents involving an onboard fire where the aircraft landed safely, but all passengers still perished. Level 4. Turkish Airlines Flight 981, March 3, 1974. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was a scheduled passenger flight from Istanbul to London, with a stopover at Paris Orly Airport. On March 3, 1974, the aircraft took off from Paris with 346 people on board, 335 passengers and 11 crew. Less than 15 minutes later, the plane crashed into a forest near Paris. There were no survivors. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10. It departed Orly at 12:32 p.m. local time, climbing toward its cruising altitude. As the aircraft passed through 12,000 feet near the town of Mo, the cargo door on the lower left side of the fuselage suddenly blew out. This caused rapid decompression in the cargo hold, which collapsed the cabin floor above it. The collapse severed several key control cables, including those for the elevator and rudder. The crew lost the ability to control pitch and trim, and engine number 2 went to full throttle uncontrollably. The aircraft began an uncontrollable dive. Flight data showed a steep pitch-down angle and rapid acceleration. The pilots issued a brief mayday call, but communication was cut off almost immediately. 77 seconds after the decompression, Flight 981 slammed into the Ermenonville forest at more than 800 kilometers per hour. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. The debris field was spread over several hundred meters. Due to the force of the crash, bodies and wreckage were severely fragmented, making identification difficult. The investigation revealed that the cargo door had not been properly latched before departure. Although it appeared locked, the locking mechanism failed due to a design flaw in the door's handle and locking pin system. This problem had been identified after a similar non-fatal incident on an American Airlines DC-10 in 1972. But the recommended modifications had not yet been carried out on the Turkish Airlines aircraft. Flight 981 remains one of the deadliest aviation accidents in French history, and the worst involving a DC-10. West Caribbean Airways Flight 708, August 16, 2005. West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 was a chartered passenger flight from Panama City to Fort-de-France, Martinique. On August 16, 2005, the aircraft crashed in western Venezuela, killing all 160 people on board. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, operated by the Colombian airline West Caribbean Airways. It took off from Tocumen International Airport at 6:00 UTC, carrying 152 passengers and 8 crew members. The majority of passengers were French citizens returning from a Caribbean vacation. The flight climbed normally to cruising altitude at 31,000 feet, and shortly after, the crew requested and received clearance to climb to 33,000 feet. However, the aircraft was close to its maximum weight, and outside temperatures were warmer than standard, both factors that reduced engine and aerodynamic performance. During the climb, the crew activated the anti-ice systems, which further reduced engine thrust. As a result, the aircraft began losing airspeed. The autopilot maintained altitude by gradually increasing the angle of attack, which brought the plane closer to an aerodynamic stall. The flight crew believed they were experiencing a dual-engine failure and reported engine problems to air traffic control. In reality, both engines were operating, but the plane had entered a full stall. Despite multiple descent requests, the crew did not identify the stall or apply correct recovery procedures. At 7:00 UTC, the aircraft entered an unrecoverable descent. It crashed in mountainous terrain near Machiques, Venezuela, with a vertical speed exceeding 7,000 feet per minute. The impact was catastrophic, and there were no survivors. The investigation concluded that the crash was caused by the crew's failure to recognize and recover from a high-altitude stall. Contributing factors included poor crew resource management, lack of stall training, and performance limitations not adequately understood by the pilots. The airline was also found to have had operational and financial issues, including missed safety bulletins related to stall conditions on the MD-82. China Airlines Flight 611, May 25, 2002. China Airlines Flight 611 was a scheduled international flight from Taipei to Hong Kong. On May 25, 2002, the aircraft broke up in midair 20 minutes after takeoff and crashed into the Taiwan Strait. All 225 people on board were killed. The aircraft was a Boeing 747-200, delivered in 1979. By the time of the accident, it had completed over 64,000 flight hours. On that day, it departed Taipei's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport at 3:08 p.m. local time with 206 passengers and 19 crew. The climb appeared normal. Air traffic control cleared the flight to 35,000 feet. At 3:37 p.m., while cruising at altitude, the aircraft suddenly disappeared from radar. No distress call was made. A few minutes later, fishermen and local radar stations reported debris falling from the sky. Search and rescue operations located wreckage scattered across the Taiwan Strait near the Penghu Islands. The investigation revealed that the aircraft had suffered an explosive decompression and in-flight structural breakup. The cause was traced back to a faulty repair performed in 1980, after the plane experienced a tail strike during landing in Hong Kong. Instead of replacing the damaged fuselage section, according to Boeing's repair manual, the airline had installed a doubler plate over the damaged skin without removing the scratched area beneath. This left microscopic cracks in the structure, which grew over 22 years through repeated pressurization cycles. Eventually, the cracks reached a critical size and the rear fuselage section failed in flight. The breakup began near section 46 of the fuselage, just aft of the main cabin. The separation was violent and immediate. The tail detached, control systems failed, and the rest of the aircraft disintegrated. Investigators recovered flight data and cockpit voice recorders, along with large sections of wreckage from the seafloor. The accident led to a full review of legacy structural repairs on older aircraft in active service. China Airlines Flight 611 remains the deadliest aviation accident in Taiwan's history. American Airlines Flight 587, November 12, 2001. American Airlines Flight 587 was a scheduled flight from New York's JFK Airport to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. On November 12, 2001, the aircraft crashed into a residential area of Queens shortly after takeoff. All 260 people on board and 5 people on the ground were killed. The aircraft was an Airbus A300-600R, delivered to American Airlines in 1988. On the flight deck were Captain Edward States and First Officer Sten Mullen. The flight departed JFK's runway 31L at 9:14 a.m., taking off just under 2 minutes behind a Japan Airlines Boeing 747. As the A300 climbed through 2,500 feet, it encountered wake turbulence left by the preceding 747. In response, the first officer made a series of rapid, alternating rudder inputs, full left, then full right within seconds. These movements placed severe side loads on the aircraft's vertical stabilizer. At 9:58 a.m., the vertical stabilizer detached from the fuselage entirely. Without the stabilizer, the aircraft immediately lost directional control. It began to roll and yaw uncontrollably. Both engines separated due to aerodynamic stress. Seconds later, the aircraft crashed into the Bell Harbor neighborhood of Queens, New York. The impact destroyed several houses. A post-crash fire spread through the residential area. All 260 people on the aircraft were killed, along with 5 people on the ground. The investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the crash was caused by excessive rudder pedal inputs by the first officer in response to wake turbulence. The side loads generated exceeded the structural limits of the aircraft's vertical stabilizer. The report also cited contributing factors, including the sensitivity of the A300's rudder system and American Airlines training program, which at the time emphasized aggressive rudder use in turbulence recovery scenarios. American Airlines Flight 587 remains the second deadliest aviation accident on U.S. soil. Dana Air Flight 992, June 3, 2012. Dana Air Flight 992 was a domestic passenger flight in Nigeria, operating between Abuja and Lagos. On June 3, 2012, the aircraft crashed into a residential area while on final approach to Lagos, killing all 153 people on board and at least 6 people on the ground. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-83, tail number 5N Ram. It was originally delivered in 1990 and had been operated by multiple airlines before being acquired by Dana Air in 2009. On this flight, it carried 147 passengers and 6 crew members. The weather was clear, and conditions for flying were normal. The flight departed Abuja around 2:58 p.m. local time. About 17 minutes into the flight, the crew noticed abnormal engine performance. The left engine began to lose power, and although thrust was reduced, the crew did not declare an emergency. Instead, they chose to continue to Lagos, even though alternative airports were within reach. As the aircraft neared Lagos and began its descent, the situation worsened. The right engine also began to fail, reducing power significantly. Both engines were eventually operating well below the level required for safe flight, but the crew did not perform proper checklists for dual-engine failure and did not communicate the severity of the problem to air traffic control until it was too late. On final approach, the aircraft lost all remaining altitude and airspeed. It crashed into a densely populated area in the Ijuishaga neighborhood, just a few kilometers from Murtala Muhammad International Airport. The plane struck buildings, trees, and electrical infrastructure, igniting a massive fire. Rescue efforts were severely hampered by the intensity of the blaze and the destruction caused by the crash. All occupants of the aircraft perished. Several people on the ground were also killed, and many others were injured or displaced. The official investigation concluded that both engines failed due to contamination and blockage in the fuel supply system, caused by improper maintenance procedures. The fuel flow was restricted to a point where neither engine could produce adequate thrust. Investigators also found that the flight crew had failed to follow emergency procedures, delayed declaring an emergency, and did not attempt to divert to a closer airport after the first engine showed signs of failure. Dana Air Flight 992 remains one of the deadliest air disasters in Nigeria's aviation history. Level 5. Nigeria Airways Flight 2120, July 11, 1991. Nigeria Airways Flight 2120 was a chartered passenger flight operated by Nationair Canada on behalf of Nigeria Airways. On July 11, 1991, a Douglas DC-861 took off from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, bound for Sokoto, Nigeria. There were 261 people on board, 247 passengers, most of them Nigerian pilgrims returning from the Hajj, and 14 crew members. The aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff. No one survived. Before departure, a maintenance issue was identified with the left main landing gear. 2 of the tires were underinflated. The technician on site attempted to inflate them, but nitrogen wasn't available. Despite this, and under pressure to avoid delays, the decision was made to proceed with the flight. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, the weakened tires began to overheat. One of them burst early in the takeoff roll, followed by the second. The heat generated from the destroyed tires started a fire near the landing gear. The crew continued with the takeoff. At the time, the procedures did not mandate rejecting takeoff for tire failure alone. Once airborne, the fire intensified. When the landing gear was retracted, the flames spread into the aircraft's structure. Because the DC-8 lacked heat or smoke sensors in the wheel wells, the crew received no immediate warning. Systems began failing one by one. Electrical and hydraulic controls started to degrade. Smoke entered the cabin. A flight attendant came to the cockpit and reported heavy smoke in the back. The first officer then reported loss of aileron control. The aircraft was still climbing, but the situation was deteriorating quickly. The crew declared an emergency and attempted to return to the airport. By then, the fire had burned through the cabin floor near the wheel wells. Passengers and parts of the interior began falling out midair as the structure gave way. The flight descended rapidly. At 8:38 a.m. local time, it crashed into the ground about 9 kilometers short of the runway at King Abdulaziz International Airport in Jeddah. The investigation found that the tire failure, combined with the decision to proceed with the flight and the lack of fire detection in the gear bay, allowed a preventable fire to destroy the aircraft in flight. The aircraft's design allowed the fire to spread into critical control systems and the cabin structure. It remains the deadliest accident involving a Douglas DC-8 and one of the most devastating air disasters in Nigerian aviation history. Aeroflot Flight 5143, July 10, 1985. Aeroflot Flight 5143 was a domestic Soviet flight from Charkhi to Leningrad with a planned stopover in Ufa. On July 10, 1985, the aircraft crashed in the Uzbek desert during cruise. All 200 people on board, 191 passengers and 9 crew members, were killed. At the time, it was the deadliest aviation accident in Soviet history. The aircraft was a Tupolev Tu-154B2, tail number USSR 85311. It had been delivered in 1978 and was operated by Aeroflot's Central Asia Division. By the time of the crash, it had logged over 12,000 flight hours. On this flight, it was carrying mostly vacationers returning from resorts in Uzbekistan. Takeoff from Charkhi was delayed by several hours. The plane eventually departed around 11 p.m. local time in high ambient temperatures. After takeoff, it climbed to cruising altitude of 11,600 meters, about 38,000 feet, which is at the upper limit for the Tu-154 operational range under such conditions. The outside air temperature at altitude was unusually high, more than 16 degrees C above standard atmosphere for that level, which reduced engine performance and aerodynamic margin. Soon after reaching cruise, the crew began to notice unusual airframe vibrations. Misinterpreting these vibrations as compressor stalls in the engines, the pilots reduced thrust twice, despite engine instruments indicating normal operation. The airspeed began to decay rapidly, dropping close to stall speed. Unbeknownst to the crew, the aircraft's stall warning system was inoperative due to a blown fuse. As a result, no warning was triggered when the plane reached a critical angle of attack. Without sufficient thrust or lift, and with high altitude and thin air, the aircraft entered an unrecoverable stall and transitioned into a flat spin. For nearly 2.5 minutes, the Tu-154 descended in an uncontrolled spin. The pilots made several radio calls, reporting the situation, but could not regain control. At 11:46 p.m. local time, the aircraft crashed into the desert approximately 70 kilometers northeast of the town of Uchkuduk. The official investigation attributed the crash to a combination of factors: crew fatigue, misidentification of non-critical vibrations, improper engine power reductions at cruise altitude, and the inoperative stall warning system. The aircraft was operating near its performance limits due to the hot atmospheric conditions, high altitude, and weight. Once the stall occurred, recovery was impossible. Aeroflot Flight 5143 remains one of the deadliest aviation disasters involving a Tu-154. Aeroperú Flight 603, October 2, 1996. Aeroperú Flight 603 was a scheduled passenger flight from Miami to Santiago, Chile, with stopovers in Quito and Lima. On October 2, 1996, a Boeing 757-23A, tail number N52A, departed from Lima heading for Santiago with 70 people on board, 61 passengers, 9 crew. The aircraft crashed into the Pacific Ocean that night. No one survived. The plane had landed earlier in Lima after leaving Miami, and passengers for the final leg boarded in Lima. The aircraft had just been cleaned and polished. During the cleaning, maintenance staff placed adhesive tape over the static ports and did not remove it. The static ports are crucial for sensing external air pressure, which is used by flight instruments to compute altitude, airspeed, and rate of climb or descent. Wikipedia.org, content reference SOA site, 0 index equals 0. The flight took off from Lima at about 05:42 UTC, flying at night over water with no visual ground reference. Shortly after takeoff, the flight crew noticed that the altimeter and airspeed indicators were behaving erratically. Warnings from the air data computers conflicted with what the pilots expected. They immediately declared an emergency and requested to return to Lima. Wikipedia.org, content reference SOA site, 1 index equals 1, because the static ports were blocked, the instruments were feeding wrong data. Altitudes displayed on the cockpit gauges were incorrect, and some information given to air traffic controllers via transponder altitude was also wrong. The crew, hearing conflicting alarms and observing misleading readings, became confused about their true flight status. Wikipedia.org, content reference SOA site, 2 index equals 2, they tried to follow radar vectors back to Lima. After about 25-26 minutes in flight, while descending toward what they believed was a safe altitude, the aircraft's left wing clipped the ocean surface. This impact damaged the wing. The plane briefly lifted again, but control was lost and it rolled over, crashing into the sea nearly inverted. Wikipedia.org, content reference SOA site, 3 index equals 3, wreckage and bodies were recovered off the coast of Lima. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were retrieved from underwater by the Peruvian Navy with international assistance. Wikipedia.org, content reference SOA site, 4 index equals 4, the investigation found that the root cause was maintenance error. the failure to remove tape covering the static ports during pre-flight maintenance. That error disabled reliable readings from multiple instruments, leading to misinterpretation and mishandling of flight data during critical portions of the flight. N. Wikipedia, org. Content reference site, 5 index equals 5. Flash Airlines Flight 604, January 3, 2004. Flash Airlines Flight 604 was a charter flight from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt to Paris with a scheduled stop in Cairo. On January 3, 2004, the aircraft crashed into the Red Sea just minutes after takeoff. All 148 people on board, 135 passengers and 13 crew, were killed. Most of the passengers were French tourists returning home after vacation. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-300, registration SUZCF. It had been in service for over a decade and previously operated by multiple airlines before being transferred to Flash Airlines, a small Egyptian charter company. The captain, Qadir Abdullah, had over 7,000 hours of flight experience. The first officer, Amr al-Shafi, had around 800 hours, and a third pilot was also in the cockpit as an observer. The flight took off from runway 22R at Sharm el-Sheikh Airport at 4:42 a.m. local time. The aircraft was instructed to make a left turn after takeoff to join its airway toward Cairo. Instead, shortly after the autopilot was engaged, it was disconnected, either by pilot input or automatically due to mode conflict. The aircraft then began banking to the right, not the intended direction. For reasons that remain unclear, the bank angle increased rapidly. The first officer called out that the aircraft was overbanking, but corrective action was either delayed or ineffective. Within seconds, the plane had rolled over 100 degrees to the right, well beyond a recoverable attitude, and started to lose altitude rapidly. There were no technical malfunctions recorded on the flight data recorder. The aircraft remained structurally intact, and its engines continued to operate until impact. But the crew appeared disoriented, possibly due to spatial disorientation, a dangerous condition where pilots lose their sense of up and down in low visibility or at night over water. The aircraft was in a near-inverted position when it struck the sea at high speed, just 3 minutes after takeoff. Recovery efforts were complicated by the depth of the wreckage, which lay over 1,000 meters below the surface. The flight recorders were eventually recovered with help from deep-sea submersibles. The investigation was led by the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority, with support from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and France's BEA. Disagreements emerged between the agencies. Egyptian authorities leaned toward a mechanical failure as a potential cause, though no conclusive evidence supported that theory. U.S. and French investigators, on the other hand, concluded that pilot disorientation and lack of proper crew coordination were the most likely causes. The airline itself had previously been banned from operating in Switzerland due to safety concerns. After the crash, Flash Airlines ceased operations entirely. Flash Airlines Flight 604 remains the deadliest air disaster, involving a Boeing 737-300. Cameroon Airlines Flight 3701, December 3, 1995. Cameroon Airlines Flight 3701 was a scheduled passenger flight from Cotonou, Benin, to Douala, Cameroon. On December 3, 1995, a Boeing 737-200 crashed during a go-around maneuver while approaching Douala International Airport. Of the 76 people on board, 71 were killed. Only 5 survived. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-200, registration TJCBE. It had been in service since 1985 and accumulated over 18,000 flight hours. The captain, Sali Yaunausa Ammon, was 45 years old and had nearly 8,000 hours of flying experience. The first officer, Claude-Émile Lambeau, had around 5,800 hours. The flight departed Kajihoun Airport in Cotonou without incident. The approach to Douala took place at night. Weather conditions were generally good. As the crew prepared for landing, they extended the landing gear. However, the nose gear indicator failed to illuminate. Unsure whether the gear was fully down and locked, the crew decided to initiate a go-around to troubleshoot the issue. During the go-around, something went wrong. The aircraft began losing airspeed. Investigators later determined that the number 1 engine had lost power, most likely due to a mechanical failure. This left the aircraft flying on just one engine. In this asymmetric thrust condition, with one engine producing power and the other not, the aircraft required immediate and correct handling to maintain control. Instead, the crew did not respond quickly enough. As the aircraft climbed away from the runway, it began rolling to the left. The airspeed continued to drop, and the bank angle increased rapidly. Within moments, the 737 rolled past 90 degrees and entered a steep descent. It crashed into a mangrove swamp just a few kilometers from the airport perimeter. A post-impact fire followed. Emergency services responded, but there were few survivors. Of the 76 people on board, only 5 were pulled from the wreckage alive. The official investigation found that the probable cause of the crash was the loss of control during a go-around with reduced engine thrust. The left engine had failed due to fatigue failure of a turbine blade, and the flight crew did not execute the single-engine procedures quickly enough. The delayed response allowed the airspeed to decay and the aircraft to enter an unrecoverable roll. Cameroon Airlines Flight 3701 remains one of the deadliest aviation accidents in the country's history. If you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and drop a comment below. See you in the next video.